a lot to do with the shoreline access work that's being done in our state. Oh my goodness, did it go away again?
Yeah, it must be something with the screen sharing. So here's what I'm going to do. We're just going to handle this as a conversational thing. And unfortunately, that'll mean that I can't share the presentation. But trust me, folks, it's just words and stuff. It's not actually all that exciting. There's no fun photographs or anything along those lines. So as Janine mentioned, my name is Mike Woods, and I volunteer with a group called Backcountry Hunters and Anglers. This issue of shoreline access has been something that I've worked on and that BHA has made a priority issue over the last several years. So I've kind of been entrenched in it. And as Janine mentioned, we met through a presentation actually on this topic a couple of years back. What I am going to cover today is first, I'll give you a little bit of an overview about Backcountry Hunters, or BHA, and about myself, how I sort of got into this organization, and how I got into hunting in the outdoors. That'll give you sort of my perspective and how I come at things like this. From there, I want to talk a little bit about a concept called the public trust doctrine. It's foundational to not only this issue of shoreline access, but really the way that we manage natural resources in our country, in North America, and in a lot of places around the world. We'll dive in to some of the history of shoreline access in Rhode Island and how we got to the point that we're at today, where we need to do all this work to improve our access to the shore. And then I'll cover some of the current events that are going on at the Rhode Island State House. I do want to leave some time for questions at the end. So if things pop in your mind, I don't know if you use the chat for that typically, Janine, or if folks just sort of hold on to those questions. This is a small group, so if something pops up and you're like, what the heck is this guy talking about? Feel free to interrupt me and we can cover it right then quickly. So Backcountry Hunters and Anglers is a North American group. I am here in Rhode Island, and I volunteer as part of our New England chapter. But we actually have similar chapters in 48 states and 2 Canadian provinces. We were founded in Oregon back in 2004, so we're a relatively new face in the conservation world. And our mission is really focused on protecting access to public lands, waters, and wildlife, and then taking on some of the conservation challenges, sometimes as boots on the ground and sometimes as advocates in the state houses and agencies across the country to make sure that we're implementing sound conservation policies to protect our fish and wildlife and public lands and waters. Here in New England, we are organized as a chapter that has all 6 of our New England states as part of it. Like I said, I live here in Rhode Island, and I primarily head up BHA's activities here, but we have similar chapter board members to me in Connecticut, Massachusetts, New Hampshire, Vermont, and Maine, all taking on similar work in those places. In the way that I think about the work that we do, I kind of break it down into 4 different buckets. Advocacy is a big one. So working with our legislators and our agency representatives who manage the natural resources that we all care about. And so there's a lot of resources over on Backcountry Hunters and Anglers' website, backcountryhunters.org, that outline our legislative work. So our priorities at the beginning of the session, roundups at the end of the session, and as things are going on and we have specific items that need attention from the public, we're educating people and we're giving them an outlet to engage in the legislative process or the agency process, whatever it may be. We do stewardship work, so on the ground sort of conservation work in cooperation with our public land and wildlife managers. These are, for example, the Department of Environmental Management's Fish and Wildlife Division. We do have a small but active U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service office here in Rhode Island that manages a lot of lands down near the coast. And also the Coastal Resources Management Council is the agency that primarily oversees our coastal zone and our marine waters, and some of the estuaries and coastal features that people use to hunt and fish. We also engage in mentoring, assisting with things like youth hunts that the state puts on that get young people outdoors. Rhode Island is actually at the point right now where they recently hired a R3 coordinator. That's a national movement to recruit, retain, and reactivate hunters. So to help people who want to get outdoors, to learn about hunting and to get started in the right way, and to have sort of a support network or a group around them that they can come up into. Historically, this was, a lot of families sort of, fathers or mothers passed on hunting to their children, or, people went off to hunt camps and had sort of their friend group, and that hasn't really been the case now. So a lot of people around the country are working to build this R3 network to get new people who want to learn about hunting involved. And we also build a community here. So we host and participate in different events like this one around New England, talking about our work, talking about what we're doing, and sometimes just hanging out, telling stories, grabbing a beer after work, that kind of thing. So if you're interested, definitely keep an eye out for events that BHA is hosting. And I will share at the end of the presentation the different ways that you can follow along with what BHA is up to. Talking a little bit about myself. So I grew up in New Jersey in a family that didn't really hunt or fish. I had grandparents that lived up in New Hampshire, and every year my parents used to sell it to me as like, you're going to go do this fun thing up in New Hampshire. You go to stay with grandma and grandpa, you go fishing and hiking and all. I think really what they were doing is they were like, I need to be away from the kids for a week, and we're going to send them up there and they'll be someone else's problem. But anyways, I did grow up hiking and fishing up in places like New Hampshire, and that's sort of where I got my start. I ended up in Rhode Island to attend college, so that's actually how I came here from New Jersey. And at that time, growing up, I had been active in the Boy Scouts, and I actually went to work for the Scouts at one of their camps out in the Southwest, taking people hiking, camping in the backcountry, things of that nature. It was more often when I was out there for me to be 5 or 10 miles away from power lines than it was to be somewhere that had electric lights. So that's really where I got sort of my start in the true outdoors world as I think about it. And through that experience, I was exposed to a lot of people that did hunt and fish, and that was sort of a top hobby of theirs. So that was another early exposure for me. My actual start in hunting happened after I adopted a dog, actually. Turns out it was a Brittany. It's a kind of a hunting breed dog. And I had gotten to know one of the guys in the rescue network that I adopted from here in Rhode Island, who was a hunter himself. And he offered to take me out hunting and sort of show me what it was about. And I loved it. I loved the food that I got from it. I loved the experience. I loved being outdoors, did not like getting up so early in the morning. And I've figured out creative ways to get around that since then. But I ended up, after that experience, sort of taking it up on my own and getting more into hunting with my friends or by myself here in the Northeast. And eventually got to the point where this was something that I really cared about, and I wanted to start giving back or advocating for the community that I'd become a part of. And that's when I noticed BHA through some of the national work that they were doing. Specifically back in 2016, 2017, there was a big federal proposal. I think the way that they worded it was they wanted to dispose of 6 million or so acres of federally owned public land out across the West. And that stuck out to me. And BHA ultimately was the group that ended that. And the congressman that had sponsored it actually ended up leaving Congress afterwards. I think it was so bad. And so I was thinking about what I was doing here in Rhode Island, which was probably on, mostly on public, maybe exclusively on public land at that point. And thinking about how important to me it was to have that access and how I would feel about it if someone in Rhode Island came and said, we want to sell off Arcadia or Big River, one of the places that I had come to love and spend so much time. So that's when I joined up. And obviously it's gotten worse or better depending on how you think about it from there. Because at this point, I've got sort of a leadership position and responsibilities and all that fun stuff. But it is nice to make a difference. So I want to get into shoreline access now, and I'm going to start by talking about a concept called the public trust doctrine. This is actually a very old principle, and it comes to us from the Roman Empire. The Emperor Justinian, it was about 500 AD, and there was some concern in their civilization at that time about sort of the common resources, right? The air, the flowing water, the shores of the sea, the places that, that were natural and sort of everyone used, right? Everyone goes to the beach, everyone goes swimming in the river, that sort of thing. But there was an issue that was so profound that the emperor set out to figure out how to protect those things for the benefit of the society that he was leaving. And he came up with this principle that that basically that these resources, the air and the sea and the shores, would be communal in nature. We're going to be considered communal in nature, and it was going to be the government or the sovereign's responsibility to care for these things for the benefit of all society. This was revolutionary. It was the first time that such a concept had come up with, but it was such a good idea that that this idea has persisted through civilizations and eventually made its way to Britain. It was reflected in the Magna Carta, or the Great Charter, which was really an agreement between the barons in the country and the king. And the king was developing resources, a little bit more than he should have. And so he struck this deal with the barons so that he didn't get overthrown. And it was very similar to this public trust doctrine. He would not develop the rivers for fishing in a way that impeded navigation, and he wouldn't build military impoundments on people's land for the benefit of the country, or what he saw as the benefit of the country at the cost of, that communal nature of the shores and the rivers and the beaches. Eventually, the concept, as Britain, developed colonies in North America, and those colonies eventually became the United States, we brought that concept from Britain to North America. And it would take a while before it would land in the courts, but the first time it did was in New Jersey. And I mentioned I grew up there. I don't like very much about it anymore. But one of the things that I do like was this foundational court case that really codified public trust doctrine, called Martin v. Waddell. It was, of course, a court case in the U.S. Supreme Court in 1842 that originated from a dispute where a member of the public had waded out into the rivers in Raritan Bay to gather oysters. Right, he wanted to feed himself, feed his family, get dinner, that sort of thing. And another proprietor, somebody that owned land adjacent to the river, felt as though this person who was collecting oysters was taking his property, that he owned the wildlife, that he owned the water, and he had this grant from Congress from before New Jersey was even a state that said so. So this dispute went all the way up to the U.S. Supreme Court, and eventually the court came back and they codified public trust doctrine, saying that when the United States became a country and states sort of entered statehood, they themselves served the role of the sovereign. That previously the emperor, the king of Britain, but the state was going to be the sovereign, and that the state held the right to the navigable waters and the soils, the wildlife, and held them in trust for the public as a beneficiary. This was, this is essentially a mirroring of that older concept, but it was very specific now to the United States. That decision has been mirrored and referenced in several really important Supreme Court cases since then. Illinois Central Railroad versus Illinois sort of brought the concept to the Great Lakes, which were sort of considered in the eyes of the Supreme Court seas. There was a case called Shively versus Bowlby that actually had a great commentary that's I think is relevant to shoreline access in Rhode Island, that stated that the colonial, the original states, the 13 colonies, actually had these unique customs and usages from their colonial times. They each had different charters or agreements with Britain that set the terms for the public trust doctrine in those places, and that the federal government wasn't the sovereign, that the states were the sovereign, and that each state could be a little bit different based on their history, their circumstances, their sort of the legal happenings in those states, and the acts of their general assemblies or legislatures. And finally, a case called Borax Consolidated versus Los Angeles was a dispute about the specific boundary. And, being in Los Angeles, this was an inner harbor of LA case where an owner owned an island, and they were concerned about where the boundaries of their land, where the sea intersected with the island was. And so the Supreme Court at that time came up with this idea of the mean high tide line, or I shouldn't say they came up with it because it is a scientific concept, but they applied it to the boundaries of public trust doctrine in Los Angeles. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later, but it is relevant because that decision has been projected over here in Rhode Island and caused some issues. Rhode Island as a state we have our own interpretation of the public trust doctrine here. We really have for as long as Rhode Island has been a state. But today we talk a lot about, at least in the shoreline access world, we talk a lot about Article 1, Section 17 of Rhode Island's Constitution. This is where the Constitution says the people of Rhode Island will have the rights to the fishery and the privileges of shore and so on and so forth. But that's not all it says. It's actually a pretty long paragraph, and later on it says that it's the duty of the General Assembly to provide for the conservation of air, land, water, plant, animal, mineral, and other natural resources of the state, and to adopt all means necessary to protect the environment of the people of the state. So that's a pretty specific statement that says a couple interesting things. One of them, it outlines sort of the terms of what's included in that public trust, but it also very clearly says that those resources are of the people of the state, and it's the General Assembly's duty to protect them as the trustee of that, of that trust. I'm at the State House often enough, and several times a year I find myself there reminding the General Assembly that they are the trustee of these resources when they think about different policies, some of which are good and would protect the trust, others of which have the potential to damage it or impact it. And that, that being in the Constitution makes it, as close to bedrock law in Rhode Island as it can be. That is the longest standing document and the most difficult for the legislature to change. They can change it, but it's tough. And it requires action of the people, like an election or a constitutional convention. So to sum up on public trust doctrine, what it is, again, is a legal principle that establishes that certain natural and cultural resources are preserved for public use, and the state is the trustee. They are the one that manages that trust on behalf of the beneficiaries or the residents of that state. Some of the things included here, like I mentioned, are navigable or tidal waters, flowing streams, the sea and its shores. Wildlife in North America is another thing that is very commonly, think back to that oyster case in New Jersey. Wildlife is something that for the most part the states manage. There are some instances where migratory wildlife are managed by the federal government under agreements with the states, or sometimes regional commissions or councils manage things like migratory fish, but primarily the wildlife of the state is managed by the state, not the federal government. And I also think, I talk sometimes about public lands being part of our public trust. They sort of are, they sort of aren't. Oftentimes, those are things that the state has used money to acquire or appropriate, and they manage them under specific plans for an outcome. Maybe they want to protect the environment that a species requires. Maybe they want to provide outdoor recreational activities. So while they are sort of part of the public trust portfolio, they don't have the same, really long-standing legal basis that these other principles that, the sea, the shores, the air, the wildlife have. So with that, I want to transition us and start talking about Rhode Island's shoreline history. I'm sure that some folks have seen sort of the news stories about shoreline access in Rhode Island, and there's so much work going on to improve and restore this historical thing. But I want to be pretty specific about how we got here and what the issue is that we're trying to solve. So I mentioned that Article 1 of Section 17 of Rhode Island's Constitution protects access to the shore for fishing and swimming and bathing, swimming and collecting seaweed, things like that. That is really only the newest revision of a very old protected right. The first time in the state of Rhode Island that we started protecting access to the shore and the right to fish and things of that nature was in a document called our Royal Charter. This is actually the agreement that Roger Williams traveled across the ocean and negotiated with the King of England for Rhode Island to become a colony of Britain at the time. And that had very specific language in it. It was important to the colonists at the time that they have access to the shore. That was the industry that they were going to build here. It was the way that they were going to feed themselves. And so when they negotiated the settlement of this colony, access to the shore and the right to fish was part of that. and it has been in every version of Rhode Island's constitution since then. The first constitution that we had in Rhode Island was actually in 1840s, quite a while after the Revolution, the separation from Britain. And there's some interesting Rhode Island history that I won't go into or spend time today talking about as to why that was. But in that first constitution, the privilege that, the rights that Roger Williams had negotiated were continued. This is the first time that we saw the language, the privileges of the shore, and that has come to represent sort of the portfolio of rights that Rhode Islanders are entitled to under our Constitution. Things like fishing and leaving the shore to swim, collecting seaweed and passage along the shore. And of course, like everything else, the courts need to find the boundaries for this. And over the years, access disputes or shoreline disputes have landed at the Rhode Island Supreme Court several times, not dozens, but at least 3 relatively prominent cases have gone up to our highest court in the state. The first one actually was pretty similar to Martin v. Waddell. It's a case called Allen v. Allen, and it arose from a shell fisherman who a landowner felt was disrupting his property by digging up the seaweed and the sand and the rocks to pull the clams out and bring them home. And this is the first time that our courts held that the state holds control over the lands below the high water mark, and they use that terminology fairly deliberately. Then about 50 years later, in the 1940s, there was a case called Jackvaney versus Powell. This was a dispute that arose actually by an action of the legislature. The town of Newport or Middletown, one of the Aquidneck Island sort of coastal towns, had gone to the legislature and asked for the ability to fence off their beach for the benefit of their residents. They wanted to exclude all the people that were coming from out of town and crowding up the beach and taking up all the room. They wanted the people that lived there to be able to use that resource that was a part of their town. And they sought to put up fences that went all the way down to the water that would keep people from, walking onto the beach. They'd have to either pay the attendant probably an outrageously high amount of money for the time, or they might not be allowed at all. And so the attorney general of the time brought this to the courts and said, the legislature can't do this. They don't have the right to because of our Constitution. And ultimately, when it went all the way up to the Supreme Court, they agreed and they said, sorry, we've got a constitutional right and you can't exclude people from using your beach. This is great. Again, they use this terminology that referenced the high and low water marks. Finally, in 1982, there was a dispute in Westerly, and this is the most recent weigh-in from Rhode Island Supreme Court on shoreline access. And what happened in Westerly was there was a group of fishermen. They had organized a coastal cleanup, and this was part of a larger movement of cleanup. This is like World Oceans Day cleanup or World Earth Day or something like that. It was a big event. It was in the newspapers. It was supported by the state to a degree. It was well known that they were going to be traveling down the beach on this day, picking up trash to improve the environment. And one of the landowners in Westerly, he was tired of people walking up and down his beach. So he hired a surveyor. He put out stakes in the beach where he thought the boundary was. And he called the police and he said, look, I got a boundary out here and these people are going to walk right over it. I want you to be here and arrest them for trespassing when they do. And that is ultimately what happened. So 6 of these fishermen who were out engaging in this cleanup were arrested, and they went through the town court. They went up to the Superior Appeals Court, and ultimately their dispute landed in the Supreme Court of Rhode Island. And they were tasked with addressing this dispute. What the court decided at that time is that the high water mark wasn't where they felt that the boundary was. They wanted to balance the rights of both sides, right? People own property, and that is another one of sort of the bedrock principles for better or for worse of North America. And at the same time, they had to grapple with this Rhode Island Constitution that guaranteed people the right to be on the shore. And so rather than the high water mark, they decided that this mean high tide line from the US Supreme Court Borax case was the best balance of the rights on both sides of the dispute. Unfortunately, the mean high tide line has proven to be entirely impractical. And the reason for that is because the way you find it is by averaging about 20 years worth of high tide elevations and projecting that onto the front of the beach. Of course, you or me or anybody that's on the beach doesn't have the ability to figure out where that elevation is. Nor is the beach today, if you were able to find it, a storm comes through or even a couple waves wash in and out, a tide goes in and out, and the sand all moves. Some of Rhode Island's beaches are rocky and they're relatively static, but the majority of the places where these disputes tend to occur is on the sandy beach that actually changes, sometimes on a daily, hourly basis. And so the people of the state, and furthermore, it's well understood and was well understood at that time that this boundary was further down the beach than the high water mark was, because it didn't account for the waves riding up the diagonal face of the beach and leaving a mark higher than the actual elevation of the tide if you average it out. So the people of the state weren't happy. And about 4 years, because something had been taken from them, their access to the shore was now in these nebulous terms, and it was less to begin with. So they came together in 1986, and this is the most recent time that Rhode Island's constitution has been amended by a convention. At that time, they continued to expand the language that was originally put into the Rhode Island constitutional back in the 1840s. And they added terminology that specifically described the things that you were, what exactly were the privileges of the shore. And this is where we get the language included in Article 1, Section 17 of our Constitution today. Additionally, they expanded another section of the Constitution. This is Article 1, Section 16, which generally mirrors our national constitution, and it speaks about the taking of property and compensation. What they added to this was they clarified that if the state takes action to protect the right to the fishery, the privileges of the shore that are outlined in Article 1, Section 17, that it shall be an exercise of the police powers of the state rather than a taking of private property. This is really important because that is the argument about where the boundary is when the boundary moves, are you taking my property without compensating me? And so back in 1986, the framers of that constitutional convention got ahead of that dispute by clarifying that this longstanding right was something that the state could protect. And that when it intersected with disputes over property, that it would be an exercise of the state's power as opposed to eminent domain, which is sort of the forcible taking and compensating of property. This is what they would do, for example, if they wanted to build a highway, but they needed to acquire the property to do it. So to sort of conclude on this section, again, the current standard per the Ibison decision of the mean high tide line, that is still in a way the law of the land, but it's completely impractical. And what that has resulted in is nobody has been arrested for trespassing and successfully prosecuted since 1982, including the group that was arrested in Ibison. But at the same time, everybody that's on the beach, and there's hundreds or thousands of people that go onto the beach, and in the weekends, we're getting into the beach season right now, their rights aren't secure. I mean, they're really at the mercy of finding the right policeman that's willing to bring them into the court system and make them defend the fact that they were there. That's not what constitutional rights should be. They should be secure, and people should know what they are and what they aren't and where the boundaries of them are. And so that is what we have been working to do in the State House, is to secure those rights and to implement an identifiable and practical boundary on the beach and effectively undo the Ibison decision from 40 years ago, because it simply hasn't worked for Rhode Islanders, and it doesn't mesh with the intent of that constitutional provision that has been around for as long as Rhode Island has been a state. So now I want to get into what is going on at the legislature now. And I'm going to start by talking a little bit about another part of the court's guidance in Ivison. One of the things that they said before, if anyone's ever read a Supreme Court decision or a court decision, an opinion from the justices, they usually give a pretty lengthy dissertation of why they arrived at the decision that they did. They sort of justify it. And one of the things that the court said in Ivison was that they had to make this determination without any guidance from the General Assembly. In instances where there is no guidance, they sort of revert to the common law or the historical law. But that there was room here for the General Assembly to provide guidance, and the court did not have that on this specific issue. So in a way, they opened the door or suggested to the General Assembly to engage on this issue and give them better guidance so that disputes could actually be resolved. And again, I've mentioned that nobody's ever really been successfully prosecuted for trespassing. And that's because, to trespass, you have to know where a boundary is and you have to cross it. With the mean high tide line, you kind of stop it knowing where the boundary is. You simply can't. And so this all sort of came to a head back in 2019. And if anyone was watching the headlines or recalls at that time, there actually was a gentleman who was arrested in South Kingstown. He was on the beach. He had, a backpack, and he was collecting seaweed to fertilize his garden. And what happened was he wandered from the town beach in one town onto a beach that was below a private property, below somebody's beachfront home. And that person had hired a security guard to inform, people doing this that it was their property, that it wasn't public, and they had to go. This gentleman didn't want to go. He wanted to collect his seaweed because his garden really needed it. And so he continued doing it. And eventually the landowner was able to get a police officer to come down and arrest him for trespassing. Ultimately, those charges were dropped almost immediately because he couldn't be arrested. As soon as a lawyer for the town got a look at it, they said he couldn't have known the boundary. How could he be trespassing then? And they acknowledged that, the police department and the town acknowledged that they actually changed their policy as a result of this arrest so that it wouldn't happen again. But it did highlight the fact that this right, this constitutional right wasn't secure. Beyond that, he actually sued the town for wrongful arrest and was awarded about $25,000 in a settlement 6 months later. So not only was the right not secure, but now it was costing the town, and really this comes out of a sort of an insurance trust that we all pay into as taxpayers. It's costing the people of the state of Rhode Island money because of this ambiguous boundary. And so at that time, legislators started to take notice, and they started to craft solutions to address this problem, to provide the clarity that we've been looking for. The first sort of steps of that movement were bills that intended basically to decriminalize shoreline access, to amend our criminal law that relates to trespassing, to specify that it doesn't apply in instances where people are on the beach exercising their constitutional right. And that was a good concept. It sort of, passed the smell test, but there were some legal concerns and things. And really, ultimately, the legislature decided that they needed to do an intensive study on this. And so they did that. In 2021, they put together a study commission that was made up of 12 members, people that had expertise in surveying and legal history and land use, regulators from the state, from CRMC, people that represented property owners, the Realtors Association, the Attorney General's office, a couple representatives from the legislature, and they got all these people and they sat them down for about 8 months, and they hashed out the issue. They brought in experts to present to them. They looked at it from every angle, and they crafted the solution that now the legislature is considering. Last year, they did draft a bill that made the recommendation, and ultimately, in the legislative process, when they put together these study commissions, they don't have the power to do much aside from issue recommendations from the chamber. What has to happen then is that representatives or senators need to take those recommendations and craft bills out of them, bills that can become laws. And so that's what they did. Over the last couple of years, the recommendations of the study commission have been drafted, modified, sort of negotiated, and ultimately what we have before us right now are two bills that are moving through the legislative process. And I'll mention today is actually a momentous day for a couple of reasons. It is both the last day or expected last day of this year's legislative session. And both of these bills, which have passed the Rhode Island Senate, are scheduled to be voted on by the House of Representatives. So we are quite literally hours away from this potentially being an approved bill that goes to the governor's desk for signature and becomes law. So I'm very excited about that. But that, I think, is where I want to end this off. And I did want to leave some time for questions. It's a little bit less than I would have liked because of my technical difficulties, but I do want to open it up. And if you want to moderate or just let everyone sort of hop in and start asking and discussing, Janine, I will hand it off to you to sort of structure that.
Thank you so much, Mike. I'm always like impressed with your ability to articulate all of the many, many details and still keep me very much enthralled because I'm not a history person. So thank you very much. I know that Casey had a question at the beginning when you were, popping in and out about how sometimes some towns have done a better job with creating those access points for the shore. And I know that shoreline access itself is, could you tell the difference first between being able to walk on the shore and then get to it? And then Casey, you'll do a better job of asking your question than I just tried to.
Sure. Yeah. So when we talk about sort of the legal structure of shoreline access, that you can break it up pretty quickly into two things, and we call them lateral access, which is that sort of moving down, across the shore, so up and down the beach. That really is where the conversation around public trust, it's the boundary of the public trust. And so that lateral access has been the focus of this legislative effort and that work. The other aspect is perpendicular access. So that's things like access points, rights of way, and the way that you actually get to the shore to exercise your constitutional right, or the lateral access component of shoreline access. I can talk a little bit about rights of way. It's a different and also complicated legal topic, but there are several ways. The Coastal Resources Management Council is the state body that sort of is charged with managing, and I'll say creating, but the Coastal Resources Management Council can't actually create rights of way or access points. What they do is more like research and designate them based on historical usage or property ownership or whatever. There are situations where rights of way or access points can be created by dedication. So this would be, for example, if you had a landowner that was really into providing public access, they could donate lands that would become a right of way. But the CRMC doesn't have the power to say, I think this would be a great place for a right of way. Let's create one here. If they lack the historical basis to find evidence that it was used in that purpose, they would need somebody to essentially donate it into becoming that. They can't, they don't have the power of eminent domain to take property and compensate against the wishes of the owner, of the property owner.
Thank you for clearing up a lot of terms that were I didn't know how to define those before, like lateral and perpendicular access is, that just was a really good explanation. So thank you. I don't know what my other, I can't rephrase my other question, I guess, right now, but I think what maybe I could ask right now that this is making me think of is are there definitions around also like this coastline into brackish water lateral access? Like where does that boundary, and I'm guessing there's going to be another like nuanced explanation. There is no way to define that boundary right now, but like, is that something that you're also thinking about?
Yeah, so practically the boundary would be where the tide flows. So with most rivers, the tide is going to flow in and out some distance up the river, and in some scenarios that can be a very specific point. For example, if you have a dam with a spillway, and that really is as far as the tide can go. In others, it might be a little bit more of a gray area, and I'm thinking of places like the Seekonk River, where there's a big stretch that that comes in and out, but it just sort of phases away. It's tough to pinpoint. It might actually be different on different days. That, if I think about where the boundaries of the public trust would be, it would be that point where the high tide actually reaches and affects the water, and within that you'd be under different laws that relate to inland rivers, and frankly, I'm less familiar with those in Rhode Island than I am about our coastal or tidal boundaries.
Mike, really appreciate the presentation, and yeah, as Janine said, all the history that you provided, and yeah, helping us to think about where folks are right now, and and who's organizing. Yeah, I have a lot of different kinds of questions, so I'd love to follow up with you about the work. I'm a surfer in one way, so lots of experience with questions of coastal access. But more pointedly, I guess the question that I have, especially around the coalition that you've been a part of, is a lot of my work is around racialized aspects of coastal space, and especially in the politics of climate adaptation. And so I've worked a lot in New York. I've Rhode Island family, been around for a long time, but only the last decade or so I've been back here full time, maybe a little bit longer than that. But my question is, a lot of the policies like in Connecticut and other places that restrict access are all about just limiting where you can park. There's the question of legibility of what's accessible, and so a lot of that, a lot of the sort of prejudicial aspects of the sort of maintenance of that space has been, in alternative means, in other ways. And so I guess I'm wondering, in what way have you found, sort of coalition building with justice-oriented organizations, and then just in what way you're sort of thinking about this question of like, maybe it's a phasing or something, but like you're here, but what does it mean to sort of ensure that folks establish this right that we get to share, which I can see as a sort of baseline, feels like that's a sort of baseline for you. But then that next question of like, so then what happens when all the cities and towns start to roll out these restrictive practices, because now there's this new set of legal opportunity, new opportunities. So just wondering like what you all are thinking about that, and what you're anticipating, and how we can think about that together.
Yeah, I appreciate the question. It's a tough one, and not because it's a tough question. It's a tough one because it's a complicated question. I will mention a couple things though. I'll talk a little bit about coalition building, and we, as we put this together, and Backcountry Hunters and Anglers has been a leading voice on this. Save the Bay has also been a really, really leading voice on this. And between Save the Bay and BHA, we have essentially welcomed anybody that wants to be part of. There's a degree of it where, if you want to get on the ship, the plank is there and you can walk right on. We want to have everybody that wants to support shoreline access with us. And I know Janine and Ria have been active in supporting this, and that goes to any organization that we see working on it. The issue of access policies in towns that restrict parking or access, the right of way might be there, but you can't get to it. That is a very complicated thing because mostly the policies that affect it happen at the municipal level. And so, there's one state house and one state government. There's 39 cities and towns. And as a result, and really only probably 20 of them have, coastal views. Some of them are landlocked. But there's, let's say 20 different bodies now that you might need to be in the room at. And so we do have an active community that, as people all across the state. So there's Facebook groups, there's people that do meetups, there's surfers that are part of this. And that is a place where a lot of the people, if it's in somebody's town, they can be part of that and they can bring the issue to groups that, when do I need to be there? What's the issue that's going on? What's at stake? And sort of handle that. But it's complicated from a bandwidth perspective, just simply because of the venues that type of work needs to happen within. The other thing that I'll mention here is that, and I talked briefly about the Coastal Resources Management Council as it relates to designating rights of way and things of that nature. CRMC is the state entity that's tasked with doing this. And, it's a wonky agency and there's a lot of room to improve the structure of CRMC. There's a lot of room to improve the funding that CRMC has to take on the work, and it's complicated historical legal work. I mean, it's not a cakewalk. But there's opportunities to improve the council. And that is one way that, that we can have an impact on rights of way and access across the state, because while the municipalities play a big role in parking and some policies to a degree, if we can get a CRMC that is more active and dedicated in finding, discovering, protecting, cleaning those rights of way, that is something that has the potential to, increase the pie. Back when they were created in the it would be like the 70s or 80s. The CRMC had a goal of creating 400 access points, 400, or discovering 400 rights of way, one for each mile of Rhode Island shoreline. Maybe not one every mile, but one for each mile. And at this point, we have about 250 designated rights of way at CRMC, state designated rights of way. So that highlights the, sort of the work that's left to do. I mean, we've made a lot of progress, but there's a lot of room to go. And the more of these places that there are, the harder it is to get them from somewhere that you can park or bike to, or, walk to. So I figured I would offer that as well, right? It's not only is it fighting to have the parking and the access to the ones that we have now, but increasing the size of the pie stands to benefit communities around the state. And it's worth considering, there's a lot of these things on the South Coast. There's also a lot of them in Providence. So they are kind of everywhere, everywhere that we have coast, they exist. It's just a matter of digging them up and doing the historical legal work.
Thank you. Because of the time, I'm just gonna interject or wrap up here. I have heard all those stories about, access points being hard to find, and folks putting up their own signage saying you can't park here, even though it's like town road. Like there's like a million stories. I don't know how much of them are factual or urban legend or whatever it is, but just for everyone's information, it doesn't scream education like this type of legislation, but it's something that RIA has decided to weigh in on, because access to natural spaces, especially in the ocean state to the shore, is really important and part of someone's being able to learn about their own natural space. So we're happy to support this, the Shoreline Access Bill this year, and then anything else going into the future. So we'll keep you updated, Bryce and everyone else, on that. Because it's almost 1 o'clock, I just want to say thank you so much to Mike and for all of you for showing up. Mike, I'm imagining that you're not going to have a problem if someone wants to talk to you more about this, that I can put you in touch with them.
Sure. Yeah. And I'll Yeah, I'll say for everybody, I mean, I'm on social media platforms. You can probably find me if you look my name up. Backcountry Hunters and Anglers. Our website is backcountryhunters.org. And if you email Rhode Island at backcountryhunters.org, that email will get to me. We are on social media, both our chapter, the New England chapter, and that's, and we talk a lot on there about the issues that are going on that our chapter is working on in this region. We also have accounts for our national organization, our headquarters. And there's stuff that BHA chapters all around the country are doing. Issues like this in, California and Montana and Texas and Wyoming and Virginia, all of it. So I would welcome everybody to check and follow us in all of those places. But again, my door is always open. Yes, of course, Janine, you can share my information. And again, I appreciate everyone coming out.
Thank you, everyone. There's a really quick survey. I'll send it to you in an email too. But thanks, everyone. Have a great rest of your day. And good
Take care,
luck,
y'all.
Mike. Keep me posted, or I'll get the alert from the legislature anyway. Bye,
Yeah.
everyone.
When you do